today's talk about Tropic Troubles, the campaign where your own hack tool hacks you. I'm Ben, a researcher with Checkpoint Software. I specialize in reverse engineering and cryptography. And before I begin, I have something I have to come clean about. About 3 weeks ago, I caught this terrible bug, and since then I've been coughing nonstop. Right now, the only reason I can stand on this stage and appear to be a functioning human being is because I'm on like 5 different kinds of medicine. So it's not a question of if I'm going to collapse mid-sentence in a coughing fit. It's a question of when. So when this happens, please be understanding. So what is this talk going to be about? Broadly speaking, it will be broken up into 3 parts, 2 small parts and 1 large part. The first small part is an introduction to Tropic Trooper, the threat actor behind this campaign that we have been tracking. Who are they? What do they do? Who are they after? How do they work? The second small part is about the infrastructure of this campaign, IP addresses, CNC servers, where are they situated, what are their working hours, and stuff like that. And finally, the large and juicy part is the technical details, the actual nuts and bolts of the malicious executables used in this campaign. After all, I am a reverse engineer, and this is the part that is of the greatest interest to me. What technical decisions do malware authors make when they put together malware? Why and how does this inform us as defenders when we are trying to put together defensive solutions? So, Tropic Trooper, who are they? They've been active for about a decade, first documented by Trend Micro in a report, and they have been for all this decade consistently targeting countries in the Asia-Pacific region such as Japan, India, Tibet, Taiwan, targeting their governments, their military, their transport sectors, their high-tech sectors, and most of the time, but not always, targeting them using Microsoft Word documents loaded with exploits for one-day vulnerabilities. What this means in practice is that if someone somewhere double-clicks a document loaded with one of those exploits and they are running an out-of-date version of Microsoft Word, and that is it, they are compromised. These are not those documents that say, please enable macros, and then you have to click enable macros. Actually, for a long while, I think I built a significant part of my professional identity around begging Microsoft to please fix those macro documents and the ridiculous ease with which people could be manipulated to just click enable macros. And then they went ahead and did it. So now there is like a big void in my heart where all this anger used to be. But unfortunately for the victims of these campaigns, these are not enable macro documents, these contain exploit. At this point, you may be asking yourself, wait, does the government of India not run Windows Update? Do they not update their Microsoft Word version when they have to? But we all know the answer, and it used to be like in fashion to point at people and laugh and say, haha, you do not follow best security practices, shame on you and you deserve it. But I think that a trend has emerged, a welcome trend of some empathy for people, and an understanding that oftentimes we put them in an impossible situation where they have to choose between following security best practice and actually doing their job. And they're going to choose actually doing their job every time. So part of our job as security professionals is to take away this burden and this impossible choice from them so they can do the right thing and do their job. So unfortunately, we don't yet live in this perfect world where we have managed this feat, which has allowed Tropic Trooper to launch a series of unending campaigns against their various targets, such as their 2016 attack against the Tibetan parliament, their other 2016 attack against the Secretary General Office of Taiwan, their 2018 attack against various Tibetan NGOs, their other 2018 attack against Taiwanese and Philippine military aircraft networks. Actually, this attack made use of a nice little piece of malware called USB Ferry, which was made to target aircraft networks. When you would plug it into a machine inside of an aircraft network, it would exfiltrate all the data it could find into the USB stick, and then when you would plug the USB stick again into the wide web, it would exfiltrate all the data from the USB stick out to the CNC server. I know what you're thinking, you're not supposed to do that, plugging the USB stick here and then there, but I already gave a long speech just last slide about why this thing happened. So unfortunately they do, which enabled this attack. So Unfettered, these guys continued on to launch another 2020 attack against the Indian power sector and another 2020 attack against the government of Vietnam. And finally, in 2021, this weird and strange campaign that I'm going to talk about now. And by the end of this talk, I am hoping you will understand why I'm saying that it is so weird and strange. So, about the campaign infrastructure. Looking at where the IP addresses used to host the CNC servers were actually hosted on which autonomous systems. So about half of the IP addresses were hosted on an autonomous system belonging to a company called Tencent, a Chinese company. You may have heard of it. Actually, they indirectly own the video game League of Legends. You can look it up, which also means that by proxy, they own that really, really awesome Netflix adaptation, which makes me kind of sad. You can choose how you want to feel about it. So that's half of the IP addresses used. Another third or so were hosted in Surprise, another autonomous system also belonging to this Chinese company, Tencent. But if you zoom in into the last fifth or so of the IP addresses and focus into that sliver in yellow, you can see what is clearly the actual smoking gun in this investigation, which is the 4% of the CNC addresses in this campaign that were hosted in a network belonging to the Marie Curie University in Poland. So there you have it. If you're wondering which nation state is it that for the past decade has been harassing India and Japan and Tibet and Taiwan, and harassing their military and their high-tech sector and their transport sector with documents loaded with one-day exploits in order to compromise them and exfiltrate all their data, which nation has had the means, motive, and opportunity to do all of that? Well, you have your answer. In this diagram, it's clearly Poland, right? Actually, this campaign took a while to get started. Before the campaign actually got off properly off the ground in 2021, we were able to witness a sort of testing phase in 2020, where the people behind this campaign would do all sorts of commits to Git repositories that they owned. How do Git repositories fit into this? Well, it's become the fashion for people managing malicious campaigns to use some sort of level of indirection in their infrastructure. Malicious samples don't just have embedded IP addresses. They use some level of indirection. Actually, we're going to see a lot more levels of indirections later, other than this one. But what's unique here is the actual use of Git repositories for this purpose. Public repositories on GitHub and on Git. How this would work is that a malicious sample, instead of directly contacting a CNC server, it would contact this Git repository and then download from there a blob, which actually would be an obfuscated address for a CNC server, and then it would deobfuscate it, and then it would contact the CNC server. So the idea with this is that actually there was something brilliant about what they did here, other than the fact that they took all this time to do a testing phase and see that everything worked end-to-end, that actually the malicious sample is able to contact the GitHub repo and deobfuscate it and everything. You may be wondering how come all of this was able to sit there in public, right? Because I'm talking about public Git repositories, and no one would notice it. Well, the answer is simple. They put the obfuscated CNC addresses inside the end-user license agreement. So, you know, no one ever reads that. That's how they were able to evade detection for all this while. We only were able to see all these Git commits in retrospect. And one nice thing that we were able to get out of all of these Git commits is their timestamps. And the nice thing about these timestamp commits, timestamps of those commits, is that they line up with the timestamps for the compilation of the various malicious executables used in this campaign. So usually when looking at the timestamps of malicious executables, you can't really trust them. It's really easy to fake them. We see them being faked a lot of the time. It's not super unusual to come across such a timestamp. You look at the metadata of an executable, and you see that it was compiled in the future, quote unquote, because someone out there was just really in a mischievous mood. But in this case, the timestamps actually line up with the timestamps for the Git commits, which leads us to believe that probably the data we are looking at here is real. Now, I'm not sure, we can't really say for sure how the working day of these guys was structured exactly. For all I know, they would wake up every day at like 11 a.m. and start working at 12 p.m. But one thing we can say for sure, if you do like a little calculation in your head, probably none of the activity spikes in this chart that you see on the bottom right were actually happening, you know, before 8 a.m. local time. It doesn't make much sense. So this allows us to put a lower bound, or should I say like a western bound on where these guys behind this campaign were geographically located, which, as you can see from the picture up here, is somewhere east of India, which is, you know, strange. Poland is not there at all. So at this point, you should have like a pretty good idea of who's behind all of this. But no matter, let's dive into the real juicy parts, the technical details of how this campaign was structured, which are neatly summarized in this diagram, which we're going to dive in, do a small dive into every part of it, but the magic begins here with this executable, which is tag nimda loader. You will see soon why. And broadly speaking, once the nimda loader is launched, it creates two branches of execution. One really, really complicated one here, which we will speak about kind of at length, and the other one, which goes down in the diagram from the nimda loader, which is one single executable, and is actually the more interesting part. It seems to be mundane at first sight, but actually it's much more rewarding once you drill down and understand why it is there and what it is doing there. So, nimda loader, what is it? Actually, it's just an implementation of the diagram you saw last slide. That is it. It's a loader designed to execute two execution branches, one very long and one containing one simple executable. And the whole reason we got interested in it, and actually this is what escalated our interest in this campaign, is the use of the NIM programming language. Now, malware authors are generally superstitious and cowardly lot. They like to stick to what they know works. They like to copy-paste code, which is why like nearly all malware is written in C language. Every now and then maybe you get lucky and see something written in Golang, and if you get really, really lucky, maybe one day you run across a piece of malware written in Rust. I know, I'm very happy every time that happens. But this thing was written in NIM language, and that got our attention. This is how I ended up one day seeing my group manager enter the room and say, Ben, we need you to research this. It's a piece of malware written in NIM. I mean, NIM isn't even the most famous attempt of a C replacement I know of. It's the second most famous after Zig. But evidently this programming language had its appeals for the Tropic Trooper guys, so they opted to write their loader executable in this language. And other than being written in NIM and being an implementation of the diagram we just saw, I don't know what else interesting I could tell you about this piece of malware, even though it took a while to figure out that that's really all it does. So about that right part of the diagram, which was very complicated and included persistence, DLLs and stuff, what does it do? Well, the first thing that nimda loader loads, it creates a process, notepad.exe, and then injects code in there. And this code eventually loads this piece of malware called YAHOYAH. Now, when I was younger and optimistic, I would stand here and read out this with conviction, this list of features with like an understanding that they made some amount of sense. But after seeing enough malware, I've become kind of convinced that every time these guys decide to create a new piece of malware, what they do is take a bunch of pieces of paper and write down features that they've seen in malware before and throw them all into a hat, and then they take turns pulling the pieces of paper out of the hat. And that's how we end up with a malware with support for 64-bit execution and pseudo-randomly generated config file names that look like gibberish, checking for whether an AV solution is running and then terminating it if it is, and instead of just downloading and executing a payload, downloading and executing a payload embedded inside an image via the use of steganography. Actually, the most interesting part about this little piece of malware, YAHOYAH, which had been actually in use for some time by this threat actor. It is even documented in the original Trend Micro report. The most interesting part about it is the part where it self-destructs when it's done, because that actually ties into its name. It turns out that YAHOYAH is a meaningful name. It's a backwards word in pre-colonial Filipino. The word is hayo-hay. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. My Filipino is really not what it used to be. And what it means is like a low-caste person, and by extension, something or someone disposable. So great, it's not just a random malware with a hodgepodge of features, it's a classist random malware with a hodgepodge of features. Then YAHOYAH, because like I said, this is now a fractured malware landscape, and really everything has to be a loader that loads a loader that loads a loader that loads a loader ad infinitum. What YAHOYAH does is load another piece of malware, but actually I omitted a detail earlier. I said that the name and the fact that it's self-destruct was the most interesting part about YAHOYAH, but that's not quite right. Actually, when we ran across YAHOYAH, which had been a previously documented piece of malware, we ran across a new and undocumented version of it, where the people who created this malware decided to add a feature. This feature, and I actually kind of like this feature, is that it looks around, it scans the ambient space of local Wi-Fi networks, Wi-Fi SSIDs, and it appends the result, the list of Wi-Fi networks, into the CNC report. So what does this tell us about the people behind the campaign? I think it tells us a little story about what they're worried about when they are operating. I think adding this feature means that a lot of the time they would get a stream of infected machines with CNC reports about infected machines. And they would look at one of the reports, they would get tired not knowing immediately what they are looking at. Who did we hit? Who have we managed to infect? So this feature allows them, I think, most of the time to just look at the SSIDs. Usually the organization would have a big Wi-Fi network just titled name of organization or name of organization guest, and that way they would know immediately. It's a nice feature. I have more respect for it than the random grab bag of pictures that we saw last slide. And in fact, the guys behind YAHOYAH, they thought this improvement to be significant enough for this malware to have a new version number. They use version strings, not exactly version numbers. And the version string for this updated version with this SSID scanning feature was endowed with a new version string called SN blah, 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 blah. And we assume that SN stands for SpotNet or Scan Networks or something like that. So, like I said earlier, what does YAHOYAH do? Of course, it loads another piece of malware. This last piece of malware is called T-Client. I really don't have anything amazing to add about T-Client because this is a tool that Tropic Trooper had used for a long while. They didn't even add a new feature for us this time for this malware. I can mainly say that it's a backdoor. When it gets to the stage where you've been infected with T-Client, that's what the Tropic Trooper actors are mainly going to be communicating with when they decide what to do with your machine once they have compromised it. It uses SSL in order to communicate with its CNC server, and this is my personal favorite part, it uses like homebrew wonky symmetric crypto. You know, the kind where you can't even be bothered to copy-paste the code for RC4, so you just throw a pile of XORs and shifts into the assembly and call it a day. It warms my heart when I run into this kind of stuff. So that's for the right part of the diagram of the execution flow, which is a loader that loads a loader that loads a loader that loads a loader that eventually installs a backdoor in your machine. But what about the other part? This is the part that in this sandbox report screenshot you can see appearing as 4 question marks. Actually, the process name is not 4 question marks, right? It's some string in Chinese, but the sandbox did not have the proper encoding configuration to display this string properly. So we had to take an actual look at the executable being launched here to see what it was. and it turned out to be this piece of software called an SMS Bomber. What the SMS Bomber does is that it takes a phone number and input and then blasts it with a continuous stream of SMS messages from all sorts of sources, rendering the phone unusable, basically. The way it does this is that it has many embedded pre-baked HTTP requests in it, and in each HTTP request there is a hole where once the person using the SMS Bomber inputs the victim phone number, the victim phone number gets plugged into the hole in the request, and then all of these requests are launched at different websites, bombing the phone with verification codes and use later announcements and whatnot. For this reason, if you look at the documentation for this piece of software, you can see the author telling people not to use their own phone number for testing. I understand. I hope you understand why that is. If you look at the file version information for this piece of software, basically the metadata for the executable, it's all in Chinese. It says it was written in something called the easy programming language. We will come back to that in a second. And actually, it says it's copyrighted to a bottle of alcohol. Technically, a pot of sake. That's how the guy called himself. That's his way of saying you shouldn't have to care about my real name. So the thing with this SMS Bomber is that we looked at it and we felt we were kind of in a lose-lose situation regarding our understanding of the campaign because it didn't make sense for this piece of software to be there. If it's malicious, why do they need to run another piece of malicious code after they've already installed a backdoor on the victim machine? And if it's not malicious, then what is it doing there at all? It makes very little sense. So in order to answer this question properly, at first we needed to do the hard work and actually understand whether this thing was malware or not, which led to one of the most miserable days of my professional life, where I looked through this thing. Actually, if you look at this thing at the surface level, the vendor consensus is that this thing is malicious. Like 30 different vendors are going to, when you take this executable and put it in VirusTotal, they're going to say, yes, this is malicious. A lot of them actually also agree about the malware name. They think that it's a piece of malware called Fly Studio. Now, not only that, but there is an embedded DLL file sitting inside of the executable. Right? A DLL is basically also in the portable executable format, so it's like a PE inside of a PEception. And the embedded DLL is packed using UPX, which is like the baby's first packer, the most basic packer ever, but still it's packed. A packed DLL sitting embedded inside of an executable, it's a really shady look. And this thing, this malware actually, not malware, this piece of software, it triggers this public YARA for the initial stage loader of the iced ID malware. So looking at all of that, you are probably getting suspicious that this thing may be malicious, and I ended up running this executable through API monitor and clicking all of the buttons and going through API call after API call, looking for the smoking gun, for the thing that will show me, oh, it's doing keylogging, oh, it's exfiltrating data, oh, it's doing anything that it wasn't supposed to do. But nope. I looked through all the API calls one after the other, and what I found was that for all intents and purposes, this SMS Bomber that says that it is an SMS Bomber is just an SMS Bomber. It does what it said it would do. And actually, if you do some searches for this phrase, the supposed name of the malware ascribed by security vendors to this software, Fly Studio, you'll find that it is a mangled name that had been adopted in the West for the programming language, is a programming language, this Chinese scripting language, which is really amazing. A bunch of security vendors had collectively decided to just shoot this programming language on site. If I were the author of this programming language, I would be really, really sad, because no one apparently ever uses it for anything other than to pack malware, so much so that like, the security industry has decided to ban this language out of existence. Very sad. So that's one thing. And the other thing is the triggered YARA rule. This is basically a signature. And now look, I work for a security vendor, so I know how security vendors like to talk about security, and they really like to talk about bleeding edge 14th dimensional deep learning security solutions, and that's nice and good. I've even worked myself here and there on bleeding edge 14th dimensional deep learning security solutions, but as a researcher, what I think is really important is fundamentals. And when you look at this signature and try to understand how come it was triggered, a signature for the ICE ID loader, which I'll give you a spoiler right now, this software is not the ICE ID initial stage loader, right? How did this happen? How did the wrong signature get triggered? If you look at the list of strings that comprise the signature, and then at the logic here at the bottom, you'll notice that there's a bunch of URL request parameters here that for three of them to appear anywhere in the file is enough to trigger the rule. And for 99% of cases, this is fine. Except for this case, where you have an executable with like 500 different HTTP requests with parameters already there baked into it. So if you look at the SMS Bomber, you have this parameter by chance appears in one of the requests, and this parameter in another, and this parameter in another, and that's it, the rule is triggered. So I used to teach malware analysis at Checkpoint's technical onboarding. I don't anymore, now I teach cryptography. But when I did teach malware analysis, there was a module on writing signatures. And I would always preach to be paranoid when writing signatures. Always think about the possible false positives, the possible false negatives, and most of all, think about the possible false positives and false negatives that you can't even imagine right now. Make your signature as specific as possible and as broad as possible, so this sort of thing doesn't happen. And somehow no one ever listened. Maybe I could have put this example, if I were still teaching, I would totally use this example. Maybe it would have made a penny drop. So now that we are finally convinced that this thing is probably not malware, it's just an SMS Bomber, exactly what it says on the tin, then how does this make sense? How does this whole execution flow fit together? Because we have the NIMDA loader, which executes this entire chain that ends up with installing a backdoor on the victim machine, but also launches like, I don't know, a shady grayware tool called an SMS Bomber, which does exactly what it says on the tin. How does this make sense? And the way that it starts to make sense is when you notice that the person who crafted the NIMDA loader, the executable where all of these chains started, took care to give it the exact same executable icon as the SMS Bomber that it launches. And when you take this into account, a picture emerges of, let's say, an educated guess for what this whole execution chain was supposed to achieve, which is that we are looking at the Trojanized binary. This is aimed at someone, some hypothetical victim, who was going to open this executable thinking that they were using an SMS Bomber. And indeed, when they would double-click it, the SMS Bomber would be launched, and they would see nothing amiss. But meanwhile, unbeknownst to them, there would be a backdoor installed on their machine. And now, accepting this conclusion forces us to also accept that there was a specific kind of target in mind when crafting this particular NIMDA loader. And the target is the kind of person who would actually use such a tool, use such an SMS Bomber. And this is so strange and so peculiar that when we published the report about this campaign, we really walked in circles around it. I don't know how many of you have watched the show Yes, Minister, but we went full Sir Humphrey. We said, if you look at the evidence and if you insist to ascribe a motive to this attack, we are forced to be possibly led to the conclusion, blah, blah, blah. Thankfully, the media exists, and the media immediately took what we were all thinking and just said it. So let it not be said that the media sensationalizing headlines is always a negative thing. I think they did us all a great service. Why did this happen? I seriously have no idea. If anyone in the audience has an idea, I would like to hear it. But it's nice that these threat actors are taking a break from bothering like the government of India and going after targets that deep in our heart of hearts, we're thinking maybe possibly actually deserved it. So I would stop here, but I actually have a parting gift for you. I actually have one last part, which is personally my favorite part, because it has to do with cryptography, which is this piece of code, which is being used somewhere along in the chain of endless loaders, loading loaders, loading loaders, for decrypting one of the configurations used inside one of the stages of the malware. And this, when you look at it, it appears to be AES, right? AES, a very popular symmetric encryption algorithm. Half of the internet is like built on it. So you look at it and you think to yourself, okay, that's AES, and then you continue reversing. But if you look more closely, that's not quite right. It's not quite right, because actual AES looks like this. The body of the loop, AES, okay, this is not the cryptography module in Checkpoint's technical onboarding, so I'm not going to get into the actual structure of AES, but let's say it is composed of these rounds, and every round has a sequence of operations, some of them involving linear algebra, the others not. And while in the actual original AES, you have 4 lines of code here, these 4 operations. In this code, the one found in the Tropic Trooper malware that we investigated, you have this copy-pasted twice. So every round, basically, the 4 actions here are executed twice. And this may seem like a small change for you, but I think that it is like brilliant, and it is brilliant for at least 2 reasons. One is the effect it has on analysts and reverse engineers trying to understand what is going on with the sample. And the other is because what it tells us about the actor behind this malware and their perception and situational awareness and capabilities. So the first reason that I mentioned, what this little change does to analysts and reverse engineers looking at the malware. Now look, I don't know how you deal with cryptographic primitives when you run across them when reverse engineering software. What I've heard usually happens that you are merely reverse engineering a function, and suddenly, horror of horrors, you run into XOR instructions. Oh no, it's XOR. So you go and launch your, let's say, FindCrypt plugin or some equivalent, and what it does is look for specific buffers, constants, that are usually in use for cryptographic functions such as hash functions or, in this case, AES. And in this case, what would happen is that the plugin would actually find the constants being used that are the same as the ones in the original AES. Right, copy-pasting the 4 operations in each round twice did nothing to change the constants. So you are going to look at this thing and say, all right, I understand this is AES, and then you are going to go on merely reversing without knowing that you have made a terrible mistake. And at some point, you're going to try to decrypt something, some part of the configuration or whatever, and you're going to find out that it doesn't work. Now, you all know what happens when something doesn't work. You're not going to immediately have an epiphany and say, oh, of course, the encryption algorithm must be wrong. No, you're first going to say, oh, well, maybe by mistake, I forgot a null byte there. Maybe I have an off by 1 euro. Maybe something about, maybe I need to try a different crypto library. Maybe I need to try a different parameter there. And by the end, it's going to take a long time until, for some reason, you finally realize that you are unable to replicate the function of this encryption algorithm in a higher level language. If you're lucky, then you're at least perceptive enough to eventually be able to say, aha, I see it, they changed the algorithm. But if you're less lucky, eventually you just give up. You say, okay, I've been sitting here for, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours trying to recreate this encryption algorithm, to recreate what is supposed to be simple AES, and nothing works, and now I'm out of ideas. So at that point, you maybe you just give up on whatever it was that you were trying to do, or maybe you use, I don't know, Dumpulate or IDA AppCall or Unicorn Engine or something like that to directly use the implementation of the crypto that sits there inside the software that you are in reverse engineering. Because for all you know, that is the only working implementation in the world right now that exists of this decryption routine. So think that this amount of wasted time for one reverse engineer, multiply that by, I don't know, let's say 200 or 300 people who are going to try looking for this malware. I don't know the exact order of magnitude for the number, but one way or the other, for copy-pasting 4 lines of code, this is an amazing return on investment. So way to go to them. And actually, that's one reason why this is such an amazing little tweak. The other reason is what it tells us about the actor behind this piece of malware. And what it says is, look, I earlier said that malicious actors, they often like to stick to what they know works. They like to copy-paste code. Usually, if you go to a malicious actor and you tell them, how about you modify AES? That's really going to mess with whoever tries to reverse engineer the malware that you're creating. They'll tell you, I don't know. Will it still work? Will it still be able to encrypt and decrypt? What if I break its security? I don't want to deal with this. But this threat actor is not your usual threat actor, and they actually sat down and thought about it. They asked themselves, well, if we copy-paste those 4 lines so that they appear 2 times in the code, will this algorithm be able to still encrypt and decrypt properly? Will you be able to take plain text, encrypt using the modified algorithm, decrypt using the modified decryption algorithm, and get the plain text back? And the answer is yes. You need to sit down with it and do a little cryptographic calculation in your head, but the answer is yes. So they sat down and they figured that out. And then for the second question of, well, doesn't this break security? Well, there are 2 answers to that. Both of them are no. There's, if you're maybe familiar with the galaxy brain meme, there's the normal brain reason why the answer is no, and then the galaxy brain reason why the answer is no. The normal brain reason why the answer is no is that this change to AES is just, it doesn't really weaken it in any way. On the contrary, it makes it more elaborate. Maybe this new version of AES is less performant. It takes more instructions to execute now. But as to making it weaker, I'm willing to bet good money that if we took this new modified version of AES, which we had dubbed AEES because of the doubled lines of code, if you took it and you locked Eli Biham and Adi Shamir in a room with it and said, go ahead, find a way to break it, and gave them, like, I don't know, 2 weeks, I think the best case scenario is that they managed to take one of the known attacks on AES and successfully adapt it to work on this new variant. But a new attack, because this modified cipher is supposedly weaker for some reason, no, I don't think that's going to happen. So that's the normal-brained reason why the answer is no, it doesn't break security. But the galaxy-brained reason is that in this case, AES is not even being used in its capacity as an encryption algorithm. Your threat model is a reverse engineer sitting there looking at the encrypted data, and they have access to the key. In this case, AES is not even an encryption algorithm, it's a glorified obfuscation routine. So who cares how secure the algorithm is in theory? What matters is how much grief the reverse engineer is going to go through de-obfuscating the blob in practice. So the attackers understood that, and that's what sets them apart from many, many other malicious actors in the landscape right now. And actually, while I'm trying to optimistically say many, many other actors, this sort of thing, during the last year and a half or so, I've seen it crop up more and more. So it's one of those things that I'm going to put on my list of things that I hope don't catch on too much. So what is the takeaway from everything we have just seen? I think I'll close this with a short takeaway, which is that it doesn't matter if you're just a humble reverse engineer trying to understand how the configuration inside a piece of malware works and trying to decrypt it, or if you're a mischievous script kiddie trying to bombard one of your unfortunate victims with a bunch of SMS messages. If you've drawn the attention of a state-backed actor enough that they have personally decided to make an effort to personally troll you, then you are going to have a very bad time. So thank you, and I will gladly accept any questions.
Thank you, Ben. If anyone has a question for Ben, please raise your hand, and someone will pass the mic to you.
Thank you, Ben, very much for the interesting and wonderful story in the background. So I do have I guess it's a clarification of the data on the first page or first two slides. So the pie chart shows that the source came from the most two big companies. One is Taiwan, another one is Tencent. I guess that might be because they are also the cloud provider, so that the hacker actually use their, for example, the virtual machines on the cloud to perform the attack.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's the one.
Yeah, look, I think that you are being careful and considerate of me. What you really want to say is that we must never forget that attribution is a crapshoot. Everything that I've just said needs to be taken with a grain of salt. We never know these things for sure. And it's true that when you look at all the data that I've showed, the circumstantial evidence for who is probably behind this seems to more or less add up. But you get accidental false positives, not only with VR rules, but also with investigations all the time. So this really is something that needs to be taken into account. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you very much. And also another comment might be, if you have a colleague who speaks Mandarin, then that makes your job much easier. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ben, for your time. We really are so pleased to have you at Hack Sydney. We have a thank you gift for you. Let's give him another round of applause.